The most successful B2B SaaS companies feel less like they're selling a product and more like they're evangelizing a movement. Think Gong's Goodbye Opinions, Hello Reality, Zuora's Subscription Economy, or the OG Salesforce's End of Software. The beating heart of these companies' go-to-market identities is a very simple story that I call a strategic narrative. And it drives success and alignment not only in sales and marketing, but also in fundraising, recruiting, product, everything. In this talk, I want to explore what I've learned about how you structure a narrative like that and what makes it powerful. The way most of us have been taught to pitch is like what I call the arrogant doctor. You have a problem, a pain, I have a solution, some treatment, and here are some claims about why my treatment is better for you given your particular problem than other treatments. So the focus is on product claims. This doesn't come from nowhere. The arrogant doctor was the guiding metaphor of the sales methodology that was all the rage in the 80s and 90s called solution selling. You were supposed to probe for pain. Similarly, another popular business book from that era, Crossing the Chasm, told us that the way you cross over the chasm to convince the skeptical mainstream buyers is by touting what the author Jeffrey Moore called your claim of undisputable market leadership. Essentially crafting a brag about your product. If that approach is working for you, keep doing it. But I found that it didn't work for me. And before I get to why, I think it's relevant to remember that the books I'm talking about, their advice and philosophy, this arrogant doctoring where you make product claims the focus of your pitch, were published about 40 years ago. The buyers they were talking about were individuals deciding between relatively simple static widgets in relatively uncrowded markets. People shopping for cans of soup on supermarket shelves or cars in dealerships. Even software back then came in shrink wrap boxes that didn't change very often. But when I started building sales pitches for B2B SaaS companies, selling to enterprises, this was back in 2009, my buyer was a very different animal and they faced a very different landscape. Every year, this guy, Scott Brinker, puts together this chart of companies just in the B2B marketing technology space. But it might as well be the chart of whatever B2B SaaS sector you're trying to sell into. And the arrogant doctor is going to struggle here because, at least this is what I found, buyers are bombarded by an ever-growing number of product claims or brags. And these products we're talking about are complex, sprawling platforms, very often with thousands of features that are constantly evolving. So even if your claim is backed up by your product, it's really difficult for buyers to validate that, to suss out whose claims hold water. And as you grow, it gets harder to nail down some distinct ICP. You're talking to multiple personas and stakeholders in the buying decision, all with different problems they want solved and different takes on which ones are the most urgent. So I started asking a question. Is there a better metaphor, to guide how we pitch than this arrogant doctor? And when I started asking this question, I thought back to an experience that I had way earlier. This is back in 1998, so like 25 years ago. I was a software engineer, and with a colleague, we built a web app that we thought could be a business. We got some users. We decided to reach out to VCs. We wrote a business plan. We sent it out, and the response was really bad. And this one VC wrote back, Andy, I rate every plan I get on a scale of 1 to 10, and yours is a 1. And then next to that, he wrote in parentheses, worst, in case we thought 1 might be the top of his rating scale. No. But under that, he wrote, not a compelling story. And a few weeks later, I was walking by this Barnes & Noble, and I see a sign that's next to this stack of books that says, for anyone who wants to tell a compelling story. And turns out that the books are about screenwriting, which I knew nothing about. And so I bought them and I read them. And what I learned from them was that every movie is a sales pitch really for a movement. So what movement is Star Wars a sales pitch for? It's a pitch for abandoning the game of self-centeredness. All Luke wants at first is to have adventures, to be a pilot. That's the game he's playing. He's just thinking about fun and glory. And that you only win by playing a new game where the goal is selflessness, introspection. What movement is Frozen a pitch for? The spoiler alert, this movie was on heavy rotation when my son, until he about turned like 8 or so. But it's a pitch for abandoning an old game where the goal was marrying royalty. That's how you got happily ever after. And playing a new one where you develop your own strength and embrace friends and family. Of course, when I discovered these books and this screenwriting stuff, I wasn't building a 3-act screenplay. I was pitching a business. So what applied, what didn't? 25 years later, I'm still asking these questions, but I did my best to answer them in rewriting our pitch. And this time we started to get interest. And a few months later, we had a term sheet. A year after that, I see Mark Benioff doing the same thing. He launches Salesforce as a movement. His pitch is that the old game, the old mindset called software, in the sense of code that you host and own, is now the enemy. And now there's a new winning game he's championing. He calls it the cloud. He's making this pitch first and foremost, not to investors or his own team, but to potential buyers. 7 years later, employee 11 at Salesforce, Tien Tzuo, goes on to found Zuora, where he does the same thing. He champions the idea that to win, you now have to abandon the age-old game of selling things. That's your enemy now. And embrace a new one where you offer things on subscription. Notice that this isn't really describing a problem. It's going to create a lot of problems or obstacles to overcome, but it's not a problem statement in itself. That's not the structure. In 2016, I wrote this post about Zuora and gave my first take on how you structure a pitch like this. And still barely a day goes by when someone hasn't emailed me to say how that structure made them more successful at selling. But I think the folks who really got this got that it wasn't just about a sales deck. That it's about how winning companies from the CEO on down, they're embracing a new metaphor. Instead of behaving like that arrogant doctor, I'll tell you about your problem, I'll tell you about my solution, and then I'll spew my unique differentiators. Zuora and the other breakout companies I saw were championing a movement, powered by a narrative about naming an old game as an enemy and evangelizing a new winning one. Like we just saw, Salesforce, software is the enemy, embrace the cloud. Zuora, transactions are the enemy, embrace subscriptions, services models. Over the last 8 years, I've gotten to work with dozens of CEOs and leadership teams on building narratives like this. And I consistently hear how they power growth not only through sales and marketing, but also via alignment in product and fundraising and recruiting. So I'd like to share a few narratives I've worked on and 5 principles for building an effective one that you can use to structure your sales pitch, but that ultimately defines a movement that your team and your buyers can rally around. When Amit Bendoff reached out to me in 2018, Gong was still a Series B company. They were growing, but still just seen as a tool for sales ops to record and replay conversations. They were still struggling to reach CROs, sales leaders. So Amit said to me, Andy, we're going to be big. I mean, he could see the trajectory already, but how big depends on the narrative. He saw the narrative as a potential growth multiplier, especially if it could hit home with sales leaders in actual sales calls. This was Gong's website back then. The sales pitch was similar, all about how Gong was for sales teams that wanted to add science to have great conversations. I remember at my first session with Amit and his leadership team, he was like, I don't really love the beakers. And Udi Ledergor was like, what? I thought you loved the beakers. And Amit was like, not really. And when I dug into it, I found, Amit, it wasn't really the beakers that he was talking about. He was saying that add science just felt like kind of a nice to have, a lower level thing. So we talked instead about the movement that Amit saw Gong evangelizing. And this was how he fleshed it out in one of our sessions together. Sales leaders used to win by gathering salespeople's opinions on things, but now they can only win with a view of reality. It's different from adding science. It's about, do you want to make decisions based on what's really happening now or not? This ultimately turned into goodbye opinions, hello reality, and it's right after this that you start to see Gong be seen as something much bigger, as a solution for sales leaders, because this has real stakes for them. I'll show you in a few minutes how Amit drilled those stakes home, but my first principle for a movement-defining strategic narrative is to evangelize an old game, new game shift in which buyers see life and death stakes. This is how, with the narrative, as opposed to just saying, like, here's your problem and spouting product claims, you're conveying urgency. It's why Chris Orlob, who I met during my work at Gong, recommends starting with the old game, new game shift for discovery. And totally, I mean, I would go so far as to say if you present the old game, new game shift, by the way, you don't need slides to do this. You could just talk to it if you want. And the various buyer personas don't open up about how that shift is playing out in their lives and what the challenges they face are around it. In other words, like giving you discovery gold. If you're not getting that, then you haven't nailed it yet. Let's look at another example. When Kabir Barde reached out to me last year, OneTrust had gotten really big, both organically and through acquisitions. It was an amalgam of 9 companies, but Kabir and his leadership team were struggling to pitch this new combined entity, like the whole suite of stuff, particularly to C-level prospects. As Kabir told me, our slide deck showed 20 different capabilities. We'd say, what do you want? So he wanted to up-level the conversation, frame it with a story. The narrative we built together with a lot of participation from OneTrust leaders in not only sales and marketing, but also product and finance and strategy, starts with life and death stakes. So it turns out a few years ago, companies with a higher trust rating started to outperform others in public markets. Kabir made the case that these companies were the ones that had made a shift from seeing trust as kind of siloed compliance initiatives or a bunch of like isolated games to seeing it as a new game where the goal is coordinated trust intelligence, where you connect all aspects of trust because privacy, ESG, ethics, all this stuff is increasingly interdependent. This is the movement that OneTrust champions. But the group they're pitching to, there are multiple personas in there. So CISOs, CTOs, Chief Privacy Officers, CMOs. So to bring this home for each of those audiences, to make it emotional for them, Kabir spells out how has their role shifted such that they have to jump on this trust intelligence bandwagon, this movement. For example, in the middle on top, the CDO, Chief Data Officer, that job used to be governance enforcer, but now organizations are looking to that person to enable the trusted data use inside and outside the company. So we have one narrative, but we can make this movement personal very quickly for multiple personas. On my podcast, Kabir talks about how this slide just really hits home really fast when he's pitching groups that include a mix of these people. So my second principle is show why every target persona's role has changed such that they have to embrace the movement. By the way, this also works really well for verticals too. I won't show that here, but you can see how you might show how each vertical is also changing. Now, I've said that the way the arrogant doctor conveys differentiation is usually you talk about a problem, you share your solution, and then you product brag. Usually some version of this. You show others have, maybe some of what we have, but we have some special stuff that they don't have, or you come up with some attributes and explain why competitors are worse on those attributes, why we're up and to the right and they're down and to the left. Strategic narrative lets you take a totally different approach to differentiation, and to see the power of it, let's go back to Gong. So Amit knew that some sales leaders would say, already have a view of reality. It's called my CRM. Thanks. So Amit showed this slide, and he said, yes, you do have data from your CRM, but let's look at that data. It's basically digitized opinions. If your salespeople are bothered to fill it out at all, they might decide, I wasn't in the zone. So if you want a view of reality, your CRM isn't like worse. It's literally not built for this new reality game, this movement that Amit is championing. At OneTrust, Kabir says this explicitly. He lists up the buckets of competitors and doesn't say OneTrust is better. In fact, at this point in his pitch, Kabir hasn't mentioned OneTrust at all. Not their product or the company. Instead, he's first making the case that if you believe in this trust intelligence movement, well, these tools can't help you. I'll show you another example of this. Kelly Watkins was a senior marketing leader at Slack before coming in as CEO at Abstract, which makes software for design teams. Kelly championed a new direction for Abstract's product, but in order to bring her team along, she told me, I need a narrative to make sense of the new product direction for buyers, yes, but also for her team. And the narrative she landed on was about how design had changed from a game of just producing the best outputs, like designs, to a new game where winning design teams see themselves as a strategic function that collaborates with other departments to deliver measurable business outcomes. Now, Kelly wanted to do what Gong and OneTrust did and say the old tools weren't built for this. To do that in her case, she sets it up with what I call the how will yous. She says, okay, you agree you want to shift from outputs to outcomes. Well, how will you make it natural for these teams to partner? How will you standardize things to boost productivity without quashing creativity? How will you attribute outcomes, results to design so that the business sees that and the return and invest in it? Without the context of the narrative, these are random like problems to be solved. But in context of the narrative, they take on emotional weight. They become obstacles to living happily ever after in this changed world we've described. Now, Kelly can say, not we're better than competitors, but literally no one else is focused on this. So principle number 3, use the strategic narrative to position competitors not as worse, but as fundamentally not built for the movement that we are championing. I talked about movies earlier. And in every movie, we learn very early about a goal state for the main character. Some state the character has to reach in order to achieve happily ever after. In Star Wars: A New Hope, we learned really early on that to live happily ever after, at least until the next movie, Luke and his friends are going to have to destroy this Death Star thing. And then when Obi-Wan lets Luke try the lightsaber, this is like Obi-Wan is giving Luke a product demo here. We already understand what's at stake, why this product matters. A great strategic narrative does the same thing. It articulates a goal state we're putting out there for the buyer to strive for in order to live happily ever after. And this goal state frames product and features with emotional resonance, or put another way, with urgency. I call this goal state the buyer mission statement. Let's see an example of that and how to work it into the pitch. Adrian McNeil is the CEO of Foxglove, which makes software for robotics developers. Say you've built a fleet of robots or self-driving cars, and something unexpected happens to one of them out in the world. You're going to need to collect tons of data from that machine, maybe recreate what happened in a simulation, remotely deploy a fix. Foxglove helps you do all that. Now, when Adrian reached out to me, he said, we do a decent job of pitching features, but not so much the kind of big picture business value we're delivering. And so I asked Adrian to show me his sales deck, and it looked like this. This has the advantage of being very simple. I mean, he's saying, hey, you have lots of data on the robots that's on the left that you need. We'll clean it up for you, make it easily accessible in all the ways you want it. But like Adrian said, this doesn't really get to the urgency. Like, why having this data is easily accessible is life and death for the robotics company that they're selling to. So we interviewed a bunch of Foxglove customers, robotics engineers, but also leaders at these companies, C-suite folks. And we teased out that there is this huge high-stakes shift happening that they see in their world. Even well-funded robotics companies used to be playing kind of the prototypes game. Now that's over. These companies only succeed if they can make production happen, repeatable success. Which means knowing at scale what your robots are doing out in the world, like why, and iterating fast. We knew we were on the right track because when Adrian's team tested this in sales calls, prospects opened up. They would say, that's right, this is happening to me. As Chris Voss famously says, when we get that's right, that's when we know we're building trust. Next, this is like Kelly Watkins's how will you slide. Adrian lays out the obstacles to winning in production. How will you process tons of multimodal data? This means like visual data, location data, all the sensor data, all this different types that's coming from the robots. How will you keep tabs on potentially hundreds or thousands or millions of devices, especially when many may be in limited bandwidth environments? Like there's no Wi-Fi for like your robot that's mowing the lawn. By the way, when sales teams present a list of obstacles like this, I love when they ask, anything we missed. Another great discovery opportunity. You knew this was coming next. The old tools weren't built for this. And then before they get into product, Foxglove lays out that goal state I was talking about, this buyer mission statement. Understand how your robots sense, think, and act. Of course, Adrian and his team arrived at this not only because it's what they believe in, but because it's differentiating. No one else in the space is talking in a big way about this buyer mission statement. And what's interesting is, after they show this, Adrian tells me next they often go into a demo, or sometimes they literally just show a list of capabilities. Now, obviously, this could be much more interestingly designed, but even this, now that he's framed it with the buyer mission, like the stakes around getting to production scaling, Adrian tells me he's having really fruitful conversations because now, something like, say, Edge Site Agent, like it isn't just a capability, it's a kind of lightsaber for overcoming an obstacle to winning in production, the production robotics game. So goodbye product does not mean, in the title of this talk, goodbye product, hello movement, does not mean don't talk about features, does not mean don't talk about speeds and feeds. It does mean don't start there. Like instead, use the narrative to very quickly create context for why product features, speeds and feeds, whatever, matter. So my fourth principle, before you introduce product, present a new differentiated buyer mission statement. We're not making context-less claims about how our product is different from or better than other products. We're claiming we're different because we built our product to fulfill a different buyer mission, one that's born of the movement we're championing. Now, I'm often asked what happens if our movement succeeds? Like the new game we've been evangelizing goes mainstream, lots of competitors come in and start saying the same thing. There's a knee-jerk tendency to fall right back to arrogant doctoring. Like, let's spout claims about our unique differentiators. But then you're back to the he said, she said feature bragging. The best example, I think, of how not to do that and what's possible instead comes from, no surprise, the OG strategic narrative CEO himself, Mark Benioff. Here he is in 2000. He famously got Salesforce employees to picket outside a Siebel conference with no software signs. But this is more than a PR stunt. In his memoir, Beyond the Cloud, Benioff says that what was successful about this was that the audience and the press remembered the story of change we were disseminating. He literally saw himself as championing a movement. Over the next 15 years, that movement took hold. The shift to the cloud became, in many industries, kind of old news. So Benioff began evolving the narrative. This is from his 2016 Dreamforce keynote. It's all about this, I would say, bigger story about the age of the customer power, all that. 5 years later, that's kind of old news. So at the 2021 Dreamforce, he evolves it again. And then this year, you can see it in the upper right corner. Now everyone's an Einstein, a new goal state, buyer mission about empowering every person with AI. So my last principle for a powerful strategic narrative is, if and when it gets old, which could be because the movement goes mainstream or just became too obvious, evolve it. Make it bigger or different, because if you don't, probably someone else will. I've heard that Benioff asks employees to get certified on his Dreamforce talk every year, and not just sales and marketing folks. I love that because I too see the sales deck, and that's what his Dreamforce is, essentially a high-level sales deck, as the primary instrument for crafting and conveying the strategic narrative. That's controversial. The traditional approach is marketing is going to build some kind of messaging architecture thing, and the sales deck will be an output of that. I ask CEOs and leaders in sales and marketing and product and other areas to collaborate on building the sales deck directly, and then make sure with sales team participation, first, that it works in real sales calls. And then marketing can start telling that story everywhere. But not just marketing. Yes, sales and marketing alignment is crucial, but wouldn't you also want, as Amit Bendoff told me he got, sales and marketing align with product? Amit told me his product team used the Goodbye Opinions, Hello Reality story as a filter to decide what features they're going to build. Wouldn't you want sales and marketing also aligned with HR? Kabir told me that at OneTrust, the narrative was this unifying element for employees across what were formerly 9 companies. And I hear from every CEO that the narrative becomes the core of the recruiting pitch. Wouldn't you want sales and marketing also aligned with fundraising? On my podcast, Tien Suo told me that investors who believed in the subscription economy narrative invested in Zuora. Those who didn't. And wouldn't you want sales and marketing aligned with overall leadership strategy? Kelly Watkins told me that her outputs to outcomes narrative was, in addition to the words that sales and marketing said to buyers, also how she gave her entire team a kind of compass to steer by, to make decisions by when she wasn't in the room. I think you would want that broader alignment, and that's why I always advise that the CEO should lead this. And when I work with teams, I insist on the CEO being the one literally in the trenches with me, authoring the narrative. Yes, with guidance from a small team that includes the leaders from sales and marketing, but also product and sometimes finance and HR, because isn't the real goal alignment across all these teams? You know, I've long searched for a theoretical framework that can explain why these simple narratives are not only effective with buyers, but also why they have this great aligning power across teams. And the best answer I've found comes from a kind of blogger philosopher I follow, a really smart guy. You may follow him too. His name is Venkatesh Rao. Rao says that for relatively simple, straightforward decisions, humans employ what he calls calculative rationality. We list up the alternatives, calculate some kind of bestness score for each, and then we choose the winner. Of course, the arrogant doctor assumes that this is how all buyers make decisions. The arrogant doctor's claims are essentially, hey, score me higher. But when decisions get complex, like which sprawling B2B software do I need among dozens of options, or what features should our team prioritize among the many we might build, calculative rationality breaks down. There's just too much uncertainty and complexity to do reliable calculations. So Rao says that we switch over to this other mode that he calls narrative rationality. Here, we think, we make decisions and act based on the most compelling and elegant story that we can improvise about a developing enactment. And that's a lot of fancy words. He's saying that when things get complex, we observe the world and try to tease out some compact, powerful story about how you win as a heuristic, a rule of thumb to guide us. And what I think the Gongs and the Salesforces and these others are doing with their narratives is teasing out that story for buyers, employees, investors, spoon feeding it to them the way movies do as a compass to guide their decision in the world. This is why Ben Horowitz famously says companies that don't have a clearly articulated story don't have a clear and well thought out strategy. Why he says the company story is the company strategy. If you want to go deeper on this stuff, one way is to check out my podcast, The Bigger Narrative. I've talked to 25 CEOs and counting so far about building and deploying their strategic narratives. Though many listeners do tell me the best part is my mom. She introduces every episode. Come for my mom, stay for the CEOs. I also post my learnings and thoughts about this stuff on LinkedIn. If you want to follow these posts or talk, I invite you to connect with me there. I love talking about this stuff. If you tried anything I talked about today, let me know how it goes. Thank you.